Okay, as you can hear from my ever so slight German accent, I'm actually not British, but I am based in Nottingham in the UK, a really wonderful place. So do come and visit if you have time. Yeah, and I'm a political scientist and I primarily research China. However, today I'm going to talk about citizen diplomacy from insight to action. So I hope you can see the screen now.
Yep.
Wonderful. What I would like to do is basically share 3 insights with you. I think the fourth we could do it if we had time, but I suspect I will have to hand over to Paul by then. So what I would like to do is on the conceptual level, I want you to reflect on the difference between top-down public diplomacy and bottom-up citizen diplomacy. I also want to hone your thinking and discuss a little bit the dangers of citizen diplomats being instrumentalized or used by governments. Yeah? And then finally, for you to recognize the power of citizens to promote change. Now, before I start, let's perhaps recoup a little bit from last week. We already learned about a few definitions and understandings of citizen diplomacy. And so this is now a great opportunity for you to reflect on them and perhaps raise your hand and share with us what you recall, what you remember, what you think citizen diplomacy entails. So maybe Paul, if you have an eye on the tiles, maybe you can see if someone holds their hands, because I may not be able to.
I think we'll let people raise their hands, but if not, then I'm going to start calling people, including it looks like Aaron has raised his hand. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, citizen diplomacy, citizen diplomats seeks to drive change, and they employ the tactics of using dialogue, collaboration, and then their work actually transcend borders. So citizen diplomacy is not limited to one country. It's a group of people who come together across the world, use collaboration, dialogue to drive change.
Wow, that's pretty much as I would define it. So I think you've got it pretty precisely. But Andreas, do you want to hear from others?
Maybe we can collect 1 or 2 more. I see one more hand.
Sami from Pakistan.
Hello, sir. Assalamu alaikum, and I hope you are doing well. So basically, what do we mean by citizen diplomacy? So I would like to say that citizen diplomacy is basically the concept that allows individual that has the right to help shape the foreign policies and the relations, and specifically, if I would say, so it also refers to the freedom of expression, that every individual in the society has the right to share their opinions and to share their collectively behavior, to share their religion, even to share their own experiences. So on a huger platform, if they share their own concept, their own ideas, so it's mean that they have the freedom to express their own self. So they are like we can also say that citizen diplomats are basically the representative of public. They want to. There are some. I would also say in communicational language. Basically, I'm a communication student, so I would say there are in a society there are always opinion leaders. So those opinion leaders are basically citizen diplomats, that they share the voices of the others, the voices of the suppressed one. like if there is a gender discrimination with a woman, or if there is a child abuse within a community. So there are citizen diplomats that share their views and that share their own ideas. They share their voice to the world.
Mhm.
Like citizen diplomats, they
Mhm.
are basically make the world as a global village because of the internet, and they share uh, their problems with the outer world as well.
Mhm.
So that is the main work, and that is mean by citizen diplomats, in my perspective. Thank you so much.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. And maybe we can collect one more,
Sure.
but perhaps briefly. Yes,
Yeah.
I see Omesi. Omesi, if I correct,
It's
if I'm correct in
Justice is
spelling.
his first name,
Oh,
from
Justice.
Nigeria.
Mhm.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, let me
Briefly, Justice, briefly.
briefly, yes. Citizen diplomacy has to do with internationally recognized and respected individuals that engage with mediation, negotiation, and bringing mutual beneficial dialogue for the interest of their country.
Mhm.
So these persons comes in to bring a mediation. They act as mediators. They act as negotiators to bring a mutual beneficial dialogue
Mhm.
between two or more countries in the international system.
Mhm.
Let me stop there.
Excellent.
Right.
I mean, I think we can already see some overlap here. All I would say is perhaps that you don't have to be an outstanding public opinion leader or a very famous person to be a citizen diplomat. That is really important, I think, because otherwise we would exclude an awful lot of people. Okay, and so in the following, I'd like to share with you a little bit the difference between public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy. They do overlap and they're often used interchangeably, but there are some small differences. So public diplomacy is more state-centric, so it's what governments do, and it's more top-down. It's an attempt to engage in political messaging, and so influencing, let's say, public audiences abroad. So let's say if Barack Obama gives a speech in Egypt, for example, yeah, that could be like an example of public diplomacy. However, in our context as individuals, we're not Barack Obama or an American president. We're talking about society-centric citizen diplomacy, which means is we don't constantly concern ourselves with the government or the state, but we're trying to act in our private capacity and independently from the government and business. So we're not talking about, like, I don't know, entrepreneurs, and we're not talking about government officials. Although government officials in their private capacity could also become citizen diplomats, for example, once they retire from service. And that does happen. Now, Joseph Nye, he coined the term soft power, but he also defined citizen diplomacy as kind of network communications. And you mentioned that, of civil societies, two-way communication, peer-to-peer. And I kind of, in my own research, I used a similar kind of way of explaining. I called it a problem-solving strategy. We're trying to solve problems. And often it's non-state civil society actors who are involved. And indeed, we're trying to mitigate difficult interstate relations and help deep-rooted conflicts, which often the political leaders, like the politicians and the business leaders, they cannot solve alone. So, and for example, this could be climate change, migration, kind of pollution issues, digital privacy, etc. So I'm not going to go into much detail here. What I would like to do, though, is give you some very specific examples of citizen diplomacy so we can learn from what I would call good practice. And so let me give you one example from history, because I think history is always quite interesting, you know, what people have done in the past. And so, for example, here is an interview with a jazz musician, Louis Armstrong, on Voice of America. And he was one of a couple of very famous Black jazz musicians who became jazz ambassadors, like Quincy Jones, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Sarah Vaughan, I think that's how it's pronounced. And what did they do as ambassadors? We have to remember in the 1950s, we had the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, the Americans would say, you look, the Soviet Union communist planned economy, not very effective, not free. But the Soviets would say, but look, America, very racist, very capitalist, not inclusive. So the Americans were under a lot of pressure also from the Soviets. And so the thinking in Washington was, let's improve our image. And we have these wonderful jazz musicians and let them play around the world so that people can listen to the beautiful music. And so they wanted to impress the world with America's soft power. So far, so good. But you have to remember, in the 1950s and early 60s, there was still segregation in America. So a lot of institutional racism. Yeah. So what does this look like? So this is, for example, a school for Black children. They could not go to the school with white children. Yeah. That's very unfair. That's not good. Or on public transport, Black people had to sit in the back of a bus and could not mingle freely. Or Black women, they could not vote until I think 1965, when the laws were changed. All of that is incredibly unfair to the Black community. Yet we have jazz musicians who are willing to represent America at a time when arguably institutional racism was rife. And so that's actually a bit paradoxical, isn't it? So one could ask the question, were they not kind of used by the government to improve America's image? Yeah, so this is a criticism that was leveled against this program. But I would argue that it's not perhaps as black and white, quite literally. The story is a bit more complicated, because when they traveled abroad, actually, Louis Armstrong and these other musicians, they were very smart. They knew exactly that they were kind of being used by the government. That's true. But they also used their platform to tell the people, yes, we are being discriminated in America and we don't like it one iota. So they were quite open about these things. And so by actually playing along, they also raised the profile and the issue of freedom of expression, the need for greater respect, etc. So they tried to use this program to advance civic reforms in the United States. And so, in a way, if we would look at this program, we could say the jazz ambassadors, they could highlight the racial inequities and inequalities. They helped usher in the civil rights era by internationalizing these issues. And by doing so, they evoked essential American values. So this is the citizen diplomacy part. But at the same time, they also kind of improved the image of the United States during the Cold War, which was something the government wanted. And the reason why I find this quite interesting is that, in my view, whether in the United States or wherever you are, as long as your government actually provides some space for genuine citizen diplomacy, I would always encourage you to use that space creatively. That's not always possible. Like in North Korea, Kim Jong-un may not allow you to do that, or in other places, maybe in Iran or increasingly in China, it's becoming very difficult. Now, there's a caveat. There is a danger of you being used by the government. And there's a very unfriendly term, but I want to introduce it nevertheless. It's called useful idiots. Now, I don't think the jazz ambassadors were useful idiots. They were wonderful people, but there is always a danger that the government uses you as a citizen diplomat. So be careful and just play along as long as you feel comfortable with the use by the government. But if you can hit the sweet spot and create this synergy between government interests and your own interests or global citizen interests, then it can be very powerful. Because of course, like these jazz ambassadors, I mean, the embassies around the world helped organize their trips, book the venues, etc. So it can be very useful to partner with the government if possible. Okay, so that's example number one. I want to give you briefly two more examples. One is from Cyprus, which is an island in the Mediterranean in the south east of Europe, near Turkey, but also kind of near Greece. And they have Turkish people in the north, Greek Cypriots in the south, and there's also like a religious difference. The Turks in the north are Muslims, and the Greeks are predominantly Christians. Now, I can't go into the details why Cyprus is a divided country, but following a coup, there was a Turkish invasion, and now we do have two entities basically in Cyprus. One is not recognized by the global international community, but still it exists. And so the problem was for a long time, how can we create peace between the Turkish Cypriots in the north and the Greek Cypriots in the south? Now, an US-based NGO called the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy went to Cyprus in 1993, and they worked with, separately, with Muslims in the north for 15 months, but also with the Christians in the south, and they talked about their needs and aspirations. And from that process, they invited 6 representatives from both sides to meet at what they call the Green Line, which is kind of where the two sides meet. Yeah, it's like a border. And that created some exchanges between the two groups. So those were the early days. And following that, this NGO trained more than 2,500 Greek and Turkish Cypriots together from all strata of the community in conflict resolution, peace building, and leadership skills. So they kind of scaled up and invited more and more people. Now, interestingly, in 2005, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Turkish Muslim North actually raised the gates of the Green Line, which had been closed for many decades. And in the first 24 hours alone, 5,000 people crossed the Green Line, and then later more than 700,000 people crossed the Green Line to see where they used to live and meet old relatives, friends, etc. And so the interesting thing here is that actually this Deputy Prime Minister had been one of the 6 representatives from the north who was involved in the initial training by this NGO in 1993. So if you add 7 years plus 5, 12 years later, he made a substantial decision that was good for both sides to have more connections, people-to-people connections. So this, I think, is a real success story. However, we must also recognize some of the limitations. So, for example, just a year before, there had been a peace plan for peaceful reunification of both sides by Kofi Annan, who was the General Secretary of the UN, but it was rejected. It was supported by the Turkish Cypriots, but not by the Greek Cypriots. So it shows, in that referendum, they didn't want that plan for various reasons, which means that you can build peace and train people, but that does not necessarily translate to, a positive referendum result. Yeah. So there are these kind of limitations, which is why I think citizen diplomacy can inform or shape the political process, but it can't kind of replace institutional diplomacy. Yeah. So we need to be mindful of that. And so the third and final example would be India-Pakistan relations. Again, I can't go too much into kind of detail in terms of the history of this conflict, but basically this was, of course, like British India was controlled by the British Empire, and following independence, we had the partition of India, the birth of independent India and independent Pakistan. The problem was that because of the way the border was set, it displaced an awful lot of people, 10 to 20 million people along religious lines, creating a lot of conflict. And actually, the two countries have waged wars against each other time and again in 47, 65, 71, and 99. So it's a really thorny and difficult relationship. Now, civic groups have tried to bridge the gaps, like like media associations, human rights groups, and other peace and democracy-oriented NGOs who have tried to kind of overcome some of the very strident nationalism, whether it's in like Pakistani or Indian nationalism and the militancy. They try to say, but look, you know, we need to get along, yeah, and we have shared interests, etc. Now, the problem is that time and again, the two countries have actually started to wage wars again. And it's quite difficult because they both have nuclear weapons by now. So it's always very dangerous when this happens. So to a certain extent, you could say all these initiatives have kind of failed because they have not really ushered in lasting peace. But perhaps that is being a bit too harsh, because it has still kind of helped at least inform the policy-making processes in both countries, yeah? To what extent is always very difficult to ascertain, even as academics, we don't know. It's very complex, yeah? And so we think that citizen diplomacy at least cannot do harm. It's not going to make the relationship worse. It can at least lead to positive change. And so one example would be a bus route that connects Delhi with Lahore. And this was set up in 1999 to improve the relationship. It was suspended for a brief period of time when the Indian parliament came under attack. Yeah, they had to freeze this project, but then it resumed operation in 2003. And actually, it has been very useful for all those kind of cricket fans. There's another legacy of the British. Both Indians and Pakistani love cricket. Yeah, and so they could visit each other for cricket matches. I mean, you need to get there. I mean, like, you could fly, obviously, but it's expensive, so you could take the bus. Yeah, and so in a way that has been kind of useful. But I have been speaking for quite some time, and I'm mindful of the limited time budget that we have. Now, kind of based on these three examples, the Jazz diplomacy, the Cyprus case of training peace builders, and then the India-Pakistani case of, let's say, economic and sports diplomacy. If you think about what you just heard, which case would you say seems kind of a more effective form or impactful form of citizen diplomacy? Over to you guys.
Thoughts, guys? Please raise your hands using the electronic. You didn't hear all that much about these cases. You may not be familiar with these cases, but based on what Andreas told you, what do you think? Justice.
Okay, I think the first one out of the Jazz diplomacy seems a more effective form of citizen diplomacy. Reason being that it was geared like towards music, and since it was geared in that aspect, when we were talking about music, it's music goes a long way in the life of humanity. Messages are being sent across, ranging from the lyrics and the beats.
Okay.
I think so. So because some music, even when you don't understand what the singer is singing, from you maybe based on the beats, you might be so curious to pay more attention to it. Like some of us here, we listen to some German songs, some South Korea songs. Even we don't know what the song is saying about, but because of the lyrics of the song, you might be so curious to give attention to it. Yeah, and that can travel a long way, because music can go a long way.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Justice, if I just may interfere. Music just don't know any boundaries, right? I mean, it's a bit, exactly. So yeah, it's a really important point in terms of like the language of music. Everyone can understand.
Awesome. Marvin, who's from China, but joining us from the USA.
Hi, everyone. This is Marvin. For this question, which case seems a more effective form of citizen diplomacy? First, I do feel all of these three are a combination of both public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy. Because without the public support, you cannot really do any of these three. You know, for the judge diplomacy, you have to have the public support to let you do all this performance, right? And for number two, you have to have the public support to open the green gates to let people cross the line, all right? And last one, to build up this bus line, you also have to have the public support from both sides, both countries. So that's why then with that, those public support, then the citizen can do their, you know, diplomacy. So, and to think which one is more effective, since I think the diplomacy is more about the interaction between different group of people. To me, we were talking about 700,000 people visit cross the borders of the, you know, Christian Cyprus and the Muslim Cyprus. I think depends on the number there, that can be more effective. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. Actually, you're from China, right?
Yes, I'm from China.
Because like in the 80s, for example, you know, there were visits from Taiwan to mainland China, and also some visits from mainland China to Taiwan. But interestingly, it didn't always create more understanding and support. Actually, sometimes it also created sort of disillusionment in terms of like how much they had grown apart. But I think, yeah, I mean, unless you meet, you don't know. And so I would assume always with people-to-people interactions, it's not always like happy family reunion where people, you know, cry tears of joy, maybe in the beginning, but then they realize, well, we are quite different. But it's still a worthwhile endeavor, of course.
Yes.
Would love to hear from others of you who haven't spoken yet. So I'm thinking Tennille, Joe, Tolls, Bell, Abdul, Mulba, we haven't heard from you guys. Would love to hear your thoughts on this particular question about what's a more effective form of citizen diplomacy, given what Andreas explained. Bell and then Tennille.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Andreas, for the presentation so far. I'm assuming it's not done, right?
Right.
Is it?
Well, I actually, Andreas, I can't remember if you have other slides. You do have other slides.
I do have a few recommendations because I think it's more about like moving forward. I mean, this is an exercise to just, you know, do some brainstorming collectively. But yeah, you go ahead, Belle.
Is it also okay if I kind of just dump my question in there while I answer this one?
Fair enough. Yeah, just keep it short.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, so I have one big question so far in your presentation, and that is what constitutes success in citizen diplomacy, right? Just overall. But then I feel like I went two separate directions, or like two different things pop up in that sense. And so, for example, I'll start with by answering your question right here on the slide. I would say C, India-Pakistan case of economic and sports diplomacy, for me, is probably the most effective form. And I'll explain this. I chose that because I'm reasoning in this way. So on one hand, I'm wondering about the prerequisites of citizen diplomacy, meaning what is needed for this phenomena to really, you know, take up and live and do what it does, right? So like what conditions or what kind of people or what kind of culture, what kind of meaning creation maybe is in play here in terms of creating, right? Like the citizen diplomacy coming alive in that sense. And so I think a lot, for example, your Cyprus case, you mentioned citizen diplomacy in that case seemed to come right after needs of the people were met. And whereas people from Australia came together, right? So it seems maybe that's a prerequisite of citizen diplomacy. And I'm a big proponent of that, right? I would say like human needs come first, right? And then the other part of it is, I don't know if this is a good question, but what are the characteristics of a person? And I don't know if that's values or anything else, but what are the characteristics of a person that embodies citizen diplomacy?
Excellent.
And so in that sense, I wonder, when we speak about jazz diplomacy, we're speaking about citizen diplomacy and jazz diplomacy within the context of a racist system, right? That's gotta mean something. And so I'm wondering, characteristics, maybe you need a platform, a person or a group, you need a platform, maybe you need momentum, popularity, or some kind of traction there, right? It's not just, so maybe I'm also speaking about how there are some more effective and some less effective.
Sure.
And then the last point within this second part is that you said that you cannot see the risks or something of the sort, but I can. Because when I think of, I feel like there's some degree here where in citizen diplomacy, especially where the government would want to use a person for that purpose, it seems like the government, there's a bit of trade-off there in terms of power, right? So the government will need to relinquish maybe a bit of that, right?
Absolutely.
And so in that sense, when you do that though with people that have a different agenda than yours, then I feel like that opens the door for so many risks and so many. I could think of other examples, right? But
yeah, can I just respond to that directly with another example?
I'm done.
No problem. Like there is one very interesting conductor, Barenboim, and he tried to bridge the Israeli-Palestine divide with his own orchestra, where he brings in young people from both communities. And I saw his concert in Berlin. And then during the concert, someone came, and I think he was more like a far-right Israeli settler or whatever. Yeah. And he said, Barenboim, what you're doing here is not peace. And he was like throwing some pamphlets, and it was a big a disruption. But then Barenboim was quite cool. He said, no, look, this is a place for music. It's not a place for politics, he said. But of course, like what he did is very political. But he then carried on with the concert. So there are, of course, always risks because some people don't like it. For example, nationalists, they will not like bridge building. That's, for example, a very real risk that you need to be mindful of.
That's a good example. And I mean, if citizen diplomacy was, let's say, this neutral platform where we can speak about, engaging and shaping policy, then the platform is open to the public and you don't know agendas of everyone.
No, so there is power involved, and you may mention the trade-offs. So that's all. We should just take it for granted. It's not an academic seminar. If you do these kind of things, there will be some reactions. But I do see maybe two more speakers who would like to kind of chip in. So,
Tennille.
Hi, and thank you so much again, Andreas, for your presentation. I was torn between jazz diplomacy and the India-Pakistan case, because for jazz diplomacy, I think that the musicians, in a time of racial injustice, they use their platform of a way of, yes, it might be a little bit of propaganda because they were representing the US. At the same time, too, they were bringing light to the racial injustices and the issues that are going on, telling people like, yes, we are aware of it, but at the same time, trying to remain some sense of like stability, like trying to keep the people together. I think that might have been more international. They represent the US, and probably jazz goes different countries throughout the world. And India and Pakistan was basically for the two countries, just India and Pakistan, but it also created some sort of like unity for the two countries. So I was kind of like torn between the two.
Excellent. And Joseph?
Well, I'm talking in general about sports diplomacy. Sports have been enmeshed into all societies forever. People seem to be supercharged around competition and sports engagement. And in terms of volume and precedent, it's just there. It's always there. Things like the Olympics, the Special Olympics, the World Games, and popularity, which was brought up by Beltina, right? We cherish our sports heroes, and we follow them, and we sort of have, even in the United States, some of our biggest holidays are sports events. And so there's also that risk always the risk of when sports becomes too political. And in the outcome of that, it's that we really punish our sports heroes when they're not living up to the standards that we want them to. So I think just because of volume, precedent, history, sports is probably going to have the largest impact across the world, because it is a form of entertainment and escapism for people, in terms of daily living and their life stresses, and that's where we live in we live out our fantasies through our sports events. And so when used properly, it can have very positive impacts, but it also can have equally negative impacts when it doesn't live up to what society wants it to be.
Actually, can I just say one thing about sports clubs? So for example, my son goes to a swimming club, and it's such an inclusive community, not just of children, but also of trainers and volunteers, that I'm always in awe how many people it brings together. So it's not an NGO, but a simple sport, a swimming club in this case, can bring together the whole community every time, like we meet them at the swimming pools or during the races. And so internationally, you're absolutely right, Joseph, it does bring together people. But of course, as you say, it can also be instrumentalized. So for example, the Olympics 2008 in Beijing, they were a big spectacle for the Communist Party. And that was also quite problematic. It was good for the Chinese people, I would say. It was a great coming out party, but the party used it also for propagandist reasons. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Right.
But, I would like to just briefly answer this one question: what constitutes maybe a good citizen diplomat? And if you allow me to just really, run through my slides in the past 5 minutes or so, then that would be greatly appreciated, Paul, because I do think we're talking really about a kind of a skill set. So let me see why it's not like advancing my slides. Yeah, essential skill sets. Because I think in theory, everyone can be a citizen diplomat. You don't have to be a PhD holder or a government official or business leader. We all can aspire to be citizen diplomats. However, we will need certain skill sets. For example, a high level of intercultural competence. For example, learning a foreign language is always helpful in that sense. Also, kind of a social entrepreneurial spirit that we think, oh, there's a problem. Okay, what could be a solution? And not just like moan and complain, but yes, we say, okay, this is the problem. Maybe this is solution A, B, C. So we need to think that way. And also, and this is really important, sometimes it may seem, oh, it's impossible. India, Pakistan, they will never get along. Yeah, but if you think that way, then you can stop. You don't even have to start. So you have to believe, I can move this mountain. It's a bit crazy. It's unreasonable. But if you don't have that kind of spirit, then you will give up very easily. And let me perhaps briefly mention some of the other competencies that I think you would need. In terms of the communication side of things, you need to be open to other ways of seeing and doing things. You need to be open-minded. Now, that sounds easy, but it's not easy because we're not always like that. You need to be self-aware of your own cultural assumptions, which you may think are the correct ones, but there are many different value sets. People have different values. And so you need to be able to relate to people who are different, yeah? Maybe culturally different, ethnically, religiously, whatever. Yeah. So you need to have those skills on the communication side. And then on the collaboration side, you need to be able to synergize different approaches. So for example, I lived in China, I worked with Chinese people, and they do things very differently from Germans. Like organizing an event, we would organize for 6 months, and lots of Chinese people, they organize for 1 month or 1 week. Yeah. So, and then, yeah, that's how they organize. So we had to learn how to work together. I would say, let's start early. And they would say, no, we still have lots of time. So very different mentality. But then you need to learn to work together well. And then second point is the fifth actually on the slide. You need partnership models. Sometimes you need to team up with an NGO. But in some countries, you have to work with the government. Yeah. And I think Marvin mentioned it, like in a place like China, for example, if the government says no, then that's it. Yeah. So you need to then have some form of relationship with the local government or whatever. And then finally, you need to be able to shrug off the constraints of ideology. And that's very difficult. We all have our own ideology, worldview, and some very strongly held views, but so have others. And if these views collide and we only shout at each other, it's not going to work. So we need to accept that people have very different ideologies and worldviews and still be able to communicate with them and work with them. And that's very challenging, of course. Yeah? And so my final two kind of piece of advice, I think citizen diplomacy is a worthwhile endeavor, but it requires a lot of time and effort. It may take 5, 10, 15 years to see results. Yeah? You need to be extremely patient. And the best way I think you could do it, try to build good relationships with key stakeholders and start small. Start with a few friends, 2 or 3 friends, or 4 or 5, have a small group, and then find more people who support you. Because once you do this kind of work, people will criticize you and say, no, don't do it. And then you need a lot of support, right? So start small, build connections with other people who can support you. And so working with NGOs is super important because they have some resources and some means to do certain projects. And local governments, sometimes you have to work with them. Try to do trainings, local pilot initiatives, engage even in policy advocacy if possible. But that's the gold standard. That's already quite difficult and quite advanced. And so my very, very final point is, of course, ideally, we create world peace, or we solve the problems between the United States and China, or India and Pakistan, or whatever. But realistically speaking, we will not achieve that. That's just, grasping for the stars. But we can have that vision and then try whatever we can in our small ways by saying, okay, there's a Chinese person living on my street. I will talk to him or her, invite him over for dinner or a barbecue. That's the kind of stuff we can do. Or we can go on social media, etc. So try to do things that can be done. Yeah? And don't be frustrated that you don't achieve that one goal in one go. Because as long as you're striving for that vision, you will make progress, small progress, but eventually you will get forward. And that's what we call progress. And I really, really invite you to be part of that journey, because I think that can be immensely rewarding, just personally. And of course, once you see some impact, it's also immensely rewarding on a professional and then, of course, political level, because you see, yeah, we made a small contribution for a better and more sustainable world.
Awesome. Andreas, this is really great. Really appreciate having you in these past 2 meetings to give us a sense of some of the history. I think it's valuable for us to know some of the history of citizen diplomacy. So I'm going to switch us quickly to, I'm going to share my own screen and give you guys some additional information about kind of challenges and as well as some of the benefits of citizen diplomacy. And then I'm just going to review some stuff. We'll have a very brief amount of time for discussion. and then actually need to get you guys to take a survey, the post survey, so that we can compare your answers before and after and figure out how much you've learned since July 10th. So, and this is to some extent going to echo some of what Andreas said, but some of the challenges that we face as citizen diplomats are things that we need to keep in mind. One is obviously there's a lack of funding for this kind of work generally, which can make it somewhat unstable. Second, there's oftentimes insufficient collaboration and communication between citizen diplomacy groups who could actually do more work better if they work together. A third thing is that the results can oftentimes, as Andreas said, take years. And he said 5, 10, 15, I would even go 20, 25 years and so on. It can take a long time. So it requires a lot of commitment. And because it's unpaid oftentimes, volunteers are in and out, come and go. So you have to have people a core of people who really have the vision and the commitment to kind of drive things forward in the long term. A fourth thing is it's oftentimes hard to measure the impact. So we're doing the impact here right now with the pre-survey and the post-survey, but you could ask, in the case that Andreas brought up, whether or not, the case of the Cypriots and the Turks in Cyprus, and the Greek Cypriots and the Turks in Cyprus, as to whether or not that training actually had the impact, or was it some other factor that led to the opening of the border between the two parts of Cyprus. So it's not always easy to measure the changes. And so that's another challenge. The last thing is, and this I'm sure Andreas knows quite well, as you grow more influential, you may face more scrutiny and even suppression at the hands, particularly of authoritarian regimes that do not like ordinary citizens butting into power and participating in power. So ultimately what we do is, if we're successful, is actually going to get blowback. In other words, it's going to get scrutiny and pushback from people who don't like this. You note this of Martin Luther King, who was ultimately assassinated. He was not necessarily a citizen diplomat between countries, but he was certainly a citizen, an active citizen who faced assassination. Now, I'm not arguing we're going to face assassination, but that's some things to consider. It all depends on what we do. So that was the dark part. Here's the positive stuff. The positive stuff to me, and this is actual and potential, right? So there are ways in which a lot of this is potential, but there are some ways in which, even in the cases that Andreas raised, that there are actual benefits. One is increasing tolerance for difference, right? Less conflict. The more people you have involved in citizen diplomacy, the more people are talking across lines of difference, getting to know each other. It's not always the case that they get along, as Andreas pointed out, between Taiwan and China. But generally speaking, there is a lot of evidence for this contact theory in psychology, which is that when you bring together people and you have them dialogue and collaborate on a sustained basis, you are less likely, you're more likely to increase nurture tolerance among them and less conflict. Second is the development of international governance. And what this means is a lot of elites use the fact that laws are different between different countries to escape power and to escape responsibility and to escape the laws. So the development of citizen diplomacy first of all makes people more aware of what elites are doing, who control oftentimes a lot of institutional power, but it also encourages the development of laws that are either the same or common or integrated between countries. And that's important, for instance, to just make sure that the elites are not robbing people in, say, Liberia and taking all their money and putting it in Switzerland or whatever else. So the development of international governance is really important, and laws are just a part of it. Third is greater accountability of the governments to their peoples, right? The more of us are involved and active and paying attention and engage with each other, learning and collaborating, the more we can hold our governments accountable to us as the public. Fourth is less inequality due to just because we're sharing resources, right? We're getting people from different countries with very different education levels and very different resources to talk to each other, to share with each other. And in doing so, we're lessening inequality, right? This process of what we're doing now is actually decreasing inequality. We're extending resources and knowledge to different parts of the world. Fifth is increasing cooperation for mutual benefit. And that happens in all kinds of spheres. For us, we do family diplomacy. That's just one type of citizen diplomacy, but it's that kind of cooperation can lead to real benefits for people. Sixth is that we become more caring and capable citizens, right? That in the process of doing this, we become more concerned about what's going on with each other's lives, what's going on in the world, and we become more skilled at speaking to each other, skilled at organizing meetings, skilled at storytelling, skilled at all kinds of skills that citizens need. And last on this is the development of a global civil society. And here, Andreas, I think, mentioned this earlier, that keep in mind, there's government, there's business, and there's civil society. We are part of civil society. And civil society is very important to give public concerns that may not be represented in governments, especially in authoritarian regimes. And so it's really important to develop. In the process of developing citizen diplomacy, we are developing a global civil society. So I'm going to review stuff. There are just 3 slides here, and then tell you a little bit about what's coming up, and then we'll open up to a bit of conversation. So you might remember we started off by saying humans are intertwined yet disconnected. Right? We're intertwined because of a global economy, of global communications, but we're disconnected in a lot of ways because we don't even know each other in many ways. And so citizen diplomacy is an opportunity for us to become connected. 2 is that families are widely valued cross-culturally, and that is the reason why we're kind of tapping into this common value of family to try to connect us across differences or lines of differences. All right. So tapping into that commonality of love and commitment to family to bridge our differences. 3 is that often families are defined by blood or marriage ties. You might remember this, but a lot of you, if you recall, when you were defining family, you were including friends and other kind of larger kinship networks. So cousins, et cetera, and so forth. So family is it need not be just blood or marriage ties. It can be a larger network that is supportive. But what really matters is who cares, right? Who's actually doing the caring work? Those are the people who actually matter to defining a family. And 4, as societies get richer, families are getting smaller, and they're getting more diverse, and we're living longer. So that's something to keep in mind because it's shaping our families, but it's shaping the life of families across the world. And as we do family diplomacy, we've got to keep on thinking of those trends. 5th is there's a lot of debate about technology, and you guys remember this. You might remember this, those of you who were involved in the earlier sessions, that we wonder to what extent TV, phones, the internet, social media are connecting or disconnecting us. And we don't have all the answers to this. In fact, it's an ongoing debate, but that's something to keep in mind because it's a very powerful force, right? Technology, and particularly communications technology in our lives, because we're spending more and more of our times on the internet, on cell phones, in social media, et cetera, and so forth. And that we need to ask ourselves the question is, what kind of impact is technology having on us, on our families? And lastly, with regards to families, family members are migrating, right? You might remember the professor who talked about migration and the fact that it's happening within and outside of countries. And what's interesting is that migration is actually for opportunity. A lot of people are moving for opportunity, education, jobs, et cetera, and so forth. Tennille here, as an example, moved from Trinidad and Tobago to Germany for better education, more education. So there are lots of people migrating, but it has an impact at the same time on family to the extent that it may disrupt families. So it's good and it can be bad, the impact of migration on families, but it's nonetheless happening, and it's happening across the world. Okay, power. Everybody, first of all, exercises power. It's not just bad people, and it's not just people in government. Oops. Please make sure to mute yourself if you're not muted. Hold on a second. There we go. Go ahead and mute yourself. So everybody exercises power, and sometimes we exercise power in good or bad ways, right? If you remember, there are 4 types of power: coercion, manipulation, persuasion, and authority. And coercion is decreasing across the world. It may not seem like it, but in fact, coercion is in fact decreasing in the world. And we are, if you think in terms of spans of not just decades, but centuries, right? Over the last many centuries, it's become harder for authoritarians to directly coerce people, to kill people, put them in prison, et cetera, and so forth. Why? Among other reasons, because of increasing communication. We're becoming more and more aware of who's killing who, who's imprisoning who, et cetera, and so forth. The ethnic minority in China that's being the Uyghurs, that are being, as an example, apparently hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, are being put in concentration camps. And the question is, people are actually learning about this stuff, and it's becoming more difficult for them to do this kind of thing, precisely because there's more public scrutiny on this. However, manipulation and persuasion are going up, right? For better or worse. We're having more manipulation and more persuasion in the world. That's, for us, not necessarily a bad thing, because it means we on our end, we're not so much manipulating people, right? We're being upfront. Manipulation means when you're trying to move people or influence them without them being aware of things. We don't do that as citizen diplomats. We try to persuade people directly and treat them as fellow human beings that have reason and that we want to move to do something. So it means so manipulation and persuasion are rising. But authority is changing. It means that we're relying less. When we see somebody as an authority, it's less because, oh, you're a religious leader or because you're a king. It's instead because of somebody's charisma. Think of sports stars, of entertainment stars. Their influence is based on a certain kind of authority, which is their charisma. Or in our case, it can be charisma. Like if you guys get really good at storytelling, that is a form of power. It's a form of authority that you are able to move people with your storytelling. It's a form of charisma. Or knowledge. You can become an expert in whatever area of family life that you are passionate about, whether it's like gender inequality, or it's about colonialism and the ways, the impacts it has on families. So that's in part what we want you to develop, is your sense of your knowledge of family and the ways in which certain issues are impacting your family and other families like you. 4, citizen diplomats our kinds of power are, as I mentioned, persuasion and authority based on knowledge, charisma, rewards, social connections, et cetera, and so forth. So last thing here is keep in mind that government tends to practice coercion and authority. There's 2 things. Businesses tend to practice persuasion and manipulation. And civil society practices, persuasion, and authority, but a different kind of authority, right, than government. Just keep in mind, government, the authority of government, right? You follow government laws in part because, well, they might put you in prison if you don't. That's a different kind of authority. Whereas our kind of authority is an authority based upon either charisma, upon social connections, upon knowledge that we have, a reward, etc. And we have to think about how we can develop that power. Citizen diplomacy. This is the last slide before I tell you about next Sunday briefly. So with citizen diplomacy, you might remember it's basic. I kind of say diplomacy is the management of international relations through peaceful means, right? Dialogue, collaboration, incentives, et cetera, and so forth. Official versus citizen diplomacy, and Andreas covered this, but you can say it's government directed versus citizen directed, right? So two simple ways of thinking about it. And we do have to be careful of the ways, yes, we can work with governments, but we have to be careful not to be manipulated by governments, because our interests are not necessarily the interests of governments, right? We have our own interests as people are interested in representing families and the concerns of families. So yes, we can work with governments, but we have to be careful about how we work with governments. Third is factors in evaluating citizen diplomacy. Just keep in mind that these are kinds of questions you should be asking about the quality of the citizen diplomacy, which is, who are we representing? What activities are we engaging in? What are our resources? Think about power, right? Power resources. What is the scope of what we're doing? So in other words, how many people are reaching? How many countries in the world? And what is the impact that we're having? How are we actually impacting people? Are we in fact having an influence on them, moving them to do certain things, moving elites to make decisions differently in government, or moving us as publics in different ways, whether it's through music, sports, economic diplomacy, family diplomacy, or else? So keep in mind also that there are types of citizen diplomacy: digital, city, health, sports, culinary, arts, peace building, family, etc. Lots and lots of diplomacies, and they're proliferating in the world. And the kind of diplomacy we're doing is family diplomacy, at least here. Number 5 is trends favoring the growth of citizen diplomacy. And this is pretty important, right? Because we're going to be tapping into these trends in order to grow our work. 1 is international transportation and communication. 2 is rising education levels. And you can say that education is a kind of power. It's giving us power. And 3 is democratization. What I mean by democratization is, among other things, whether or not authoritarians like it or not, they're holding elections. They used to just be able to say, hey, I'm king, I don't need to hold elections. Nowadays, they say, okay, we have to hold elections. They may rig the elections so that everybody votes for them, or 95% of the population votes for them. But nonetheless, they still have to kind of at least give lip service to democracy. And that is a change in the long history of humanity, right? We are moving towards democracy in fits and starts, and it goes back and forth, etc. But the general long-term trend is that people support freedom and equality of rights for more and more human beings. And it's harder for authoritarians to get beyond that, to fight that. It's becoming harder. They're doing it in various ways, but they can't do it as coercively as they used to. They can't just simply shoot people as easily as they used to. They still are, by the way. I'm not saying that authoritarians are not killing people. They just can't kill people with impunity as they used to, right? And last is citizen diplomacy skills and virtue. So this gets at some of what Andreas was saying. You need determination. If you're going to make change, and change requires like 5, 10, 20, 15, 20 years or more, you have to be determined about this. You have to be patient and determined. 2 is you need that intercultural competence that he talked about. That's learning a language other than English. You guys are already citizen diplomats in that sense. You already have that because you speak English quite well, or you speak another language. You speak 2 or more or 3 languages. And then this social entrepreneurialism that he was talking about is our ability, to me, as I understand it, is our ability to get together and exercise power as citizens, right? And think through how you do that, how you communicate with people to get them to join, how you sustain their engagement, how you get them to work together towards a goal. That's all social entrepreneurialism. And that's in part what we need to do as citizens. Okay, I'm going to finish off by telling you about what's coming up next, and then we're going to have a little discussion, and then we are going to, in little discussion, I mean like 5-10 minutes of discussion, and then I have to jump in and do the survey with those of you who are with us and took the pre-survey. If you didn't take the pre-survey, don't worry about it. But here's what's coming up next. Part 2 starts next Sunday. It goes until October 23rd. We are focusing on family storytelling. So it's going to be a lot more of not me talking and not Andreas and not the former professors. And it's going to be actually a lot of you guys developing your stories and practicing them. And more specifically, so keep in mind that you're going to be developing a 5-minute story. So you'll only have 5 minutes to tell it. And we're going to be asking you to write down that story so that you can actually tell it in 5 minutes effectively. And you have to connect it to some sort of larger issue, whatever issue you decide upon. And it doesn't have to necessarily be about your family. It can be about another family. So it can be about cancer, about gender inequality, about corruption, about climate change, about colonialism or neocolonialism. It can be about whatever issue is affecting the families that you care about. And in terms of process, so the first 2 meetings, August 28th and September 4th, you're just going to be telling stories. You do not need to prepare for this. In fact, I encourage you not to prepare for this. Just come into the meeting, and each of you is going to tell a story, and we're going to video record your storytelling. That is going to be the pre-test. Okay, it's pre-test. And then on September 11th, we're having a training. We're inviting 3 people to help train you guys in how to tell these stories better. And then on September 18th, 25th, and October 2nd, practice, practice, practice. You guys will get to practice your stories with us again. You'll get to rework your stories. You'll get to decide, oh, I don't want to do this, etc. And we're going to give you feedback. So this is going to be highly participatory. It's you guys contributing to make your stories better. The last thing is post-test storytelling. So we are going to gather an international audience for you, and you're going to be performing your stories. You'll have 5 minutes to perform them, and the most improved storytellers will get awards. So we have stipends and we have awards for those of you who have completed part 1 to continue with part 2 of the it's not a lot of money, but it's basically $100 for the stipends, and then an additional $100 if you happen to be among the most improved storytellers. And the last meeting on October 24th, we're just going to bring everybody together, feedback, get your feedback, get your reflections, and award certificates for those who've completed that part 2 of the storytelling. All right, I'm stopping. Let's talk. Questions that you guys have. Any thoughts?
Sorry, Paul, are the part 2 sessions all on Sunday as well, same time?
Yes, same time. Okay. And we may just use the same Zoom, but I'll let you know if we change the Zoom. Tennille.
Hi, yes, my quick question was, out of the 3 options between India and Pakistan and Cyprus and jazz diplomacy, which one was the most efficient representation of citizens diplomacy?
I don't think there's a correct answer to that, right, Andreas?
There's none.
Yes, yeah, I mean, actually, you would need to, as Paul alluded to, if you really wanted to assess it very scientifically, I don't think you can, because it's such a complex process. You would need to first find a set of criteria and then do your research, and then eventually you could come up with a scientific answer. I do believe that all of these initiatives are useful. how impactful they are sometimes can also come down to sheer luck. I do believe in chaos theory, like literally a butterfly in the Amazon in Brazil may set off a storm in Europe. But that's just how I think about the world. Some other people think about the world in very mechanistic ways. Because you do this, it leads to that. But normally the world is more complex than that. So yeah, I would always encourage these kind of initiatives, but I think we need to just be realistic about, the impact chain. Sometimes the impact may be just very small, and that's fine. But sometimes if we're lucky, that impact may actually last a bit longer. And that's great. But it's very hard to prove, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Let me quickly answer before we go to Sammy and then Aaron. I think Aaron, to your question in the Zoom chat, what is the main difference between citizen diplomacy and civil society organizations such as policy think tanks? I think it really depends on, and you guys got this, right? I was really impressed with your definitions of citizen diplomacy, because I think you essentially get it. Citizen diplomacy happens cross-nationally, right? That's the diplomacy part. Now, some people say, well, citizen diplomacy happens anywhere and it can be inside nations. But really, I think if you're going to stick, at least for our purposes, citizen diplomacy happens across nations. So it's dialogue and collaboration between citizens of different nations for common purposes. And so, so a civil society group, if it's just focused inside its country, then it's not citizen diplomacy. But if it's focused internationally and they're collaborating or engaging in dialogue internationally, that's a form of citizen diplomacy. That is citizen diplomacy, you might say. I hope that's helpful. Sammy.
Yeah, Paul. My question is basically that how we would represent our story. Like it would be in a written, or we will have to perform it on camera.
Yes. So good question. I'm glad you're asking, Sammy. It is oral storytelling. In other words, you're going to be telling the story on camera and live. So you have to take that into account. In some of your cases, you may not live in entirely free societies, and so you have to be careful about how you tell your story. And that's just something, because this is very public. You're going to be recorded. You're going to have a live international audience at the end, right, on October 9th and 16th, when you guys perform your stories. And then we'll have discussion around your stories.
Right, like can we perform it in my own room? Like should I have to choose a specific area for that, or do I need to take characters as well, or not just a solo one?
We're going to talk about that. You'll get lots of answers to this thing in the next part, in part 2. And that's in part of kind of figuring out family storytelling, or any kind of storytelling, is like, what's going to be my backdrop? How am I going to present myself? Who's going to be involved? There are all kinds of questions you need to be asking yourself. But for now, don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Come next Sunday and the Sunday afterwards, you guys are actually going to perform a story, but you do not need to prepare for it. We actually want you to just come into this without any preparation or training. Just come in and tell a story. You can figure out a story you want to tell. You're just going to have 5 minutes to tell it. So we are going to ask you during the training to write down your story, in part because writing down your story is going to allow you to train yourself to get it all in and to say it in 5 minutes. So
yeah, I got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. I guess it's a question for everyone, but especially for Paul and Andreas. I was wondering, I don't know, for some reason it's just coming up today, but the connection between civic education and citizen diplomacy. I don't think, so I did miss 2 sessions. I don't know if that was covered at that point, but I think it's interesting, because if civic education, for example, in Europe, I remember like I had class, right, called that way in Italy, where you learn about certain things, right? And so it's kind of this transmission of perhaps, national values and what have you. And then it kind of seems like a nice transition from civic education to citizen diplomacy. Not necessarily, it's just, what do you think about that?
Andreas?
Oh, it would be very beneficial. Unfortunately, our governments and schools are not always that interested in civic education. They may prioritize like the STEM subjects like math, physics, what have you. And so in my experience, it's often left to NGOs to do this kind of capacity building. And I think it's extremely valuable. I've learned so much actually during my time in China with environmental NGOs, community-based groups, political development NGOs. Like much of my political education I got from NGO trainings. I'm not kidding you, despite having had all this university education. But I learned a lot from civil society practitioners.
Did you say you were from Germany? Did you take when you were younger class?
They have a little bit, like we learned about, like, I don't know, democratization in Eastern Europe, but only very late in the 9th or 10th grade. So it was a special class which ran only for a year or two. So it's other, maybe in history, but not necessarily, they didn't teach us, I don't know, the value of constitutionalism or elections, stuff like that.
Joe, last, and then we actually need to move on to do this survey. Joe.
Just quickly, I mean, we have civics classes here in the United States. It's part of the curriculum. But what we see happening now is that governments are trying to take over the curriculum and removing stuff from the classes. And so there is in the overreach of power to control that sort of education. And so if it's not pure and coming from a place that's neutral, there's going to be an entire generation of kids who are going to think of civics much differently than generations before them.
So the only thing, Belle, that I would say in addition to this is that, again, like to focus on civic education. Civic education is oftentimes happens just within a country, and it's focused on education for citizenship in that country. Citizen diplomacy is different because it is involving people in international affairs, right? So that's, I think, the key difference, at least to me. But you can have civic education that's internationally focused, right? Global citizenship education. So, all right. So, Andreas, you don't necessarily, if you want to attend this part, you can, but if you don't want to, you can sign off. We just need to do the survey at the end.
I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining today and for me having this opportunity to share a little bit of my insights. It's greatly appreciated. Also, thank you, Paul. And I hope to hear about your success stories in the future. And I'm sure many of you will become, future leaders and our, future educators. So we can resign and, I don't know, sit in the garden and be reminiscent of our own youth and activism when you carry on the torch. So bye for now.